Welcome class to Immigration and Free Trade Agreement. The overview of these chapters we read for this week was deportation policy and the making and unmaking of illegal aliens. And the second piece we were looking at free trade, the final conquest of Latin America. So looking at the chapter deportation policy and the making of unmaking illegal aliens, I kind of broke it down into four pieces, breaking it a little bit more simple. One is examining how the U.S. immigration law has constructed this concept of how deportation policy has been used, enforcing racial national boundaries, the role deportation, building the making of illegal aliens, and legal and social marginality, right? So as we look at the chapters, they're all both chapters are very dense, but they're giving a historical analysis, right? What does it mean? The creation of deportation, how did these policies were created? How did it became to be, right? In a more of a historical timeline, deportation didn't really exist, or even the word of aliens, right? So here, right, in the making of illegal aliens is telling us, illegal aliens not as natural, self-efficient concept, but rather product specific legal political process that became in the 20th century, right? So a lot of these terms that we're reading the chapter, it all became part because a lot of the migration that was happening. So as a concept, within the United States, it, wanted to have a pause that is, how do we create these names for certain people, even though almost like the chapters we have read, right? The creation of Hispanic, the creation of the term Latin, Latinos, so, and here this concept, the term was illegal alien, right? So here we're talking about the Immigration Act of 1924, introduces its origin quotas of the first time meeting, right? So a lot of this also came from the Chinese Exclusion Act, right? When we read the chapter, how did it came to be, but also the use of these people for a long time, right? So as we understand the history within the U.S. early on, even before the 1920s, we look at the history within the U.S. as a social work, but also as a working class, right? Not just from like, white folks, brown folks, but also the Chinese as well, right? So here we are talking about the concept of illegal aliens, right? One of the making and one of the unmaking. So how did this concept became? One is through legislation, right? Second, social political factors, right? And also the economic forces. So all these three terms are basically, even with today's day, when we're looking at the job sector, who do they want within the U.S., who they want through the U.S., looking at quotas, right? So, but also the other part is the making of illegal aliens, right? Deferred deportation. Some policies allow to document individuals to stay temporarily, even the lack of formal status does not always confer permanent legal status, but can delay deportation, right? So these were referring to such as like people have visas, people have residencies, right? Some to this allow you to stay, but if you have residency, it does not give you U.S. citizenship, right? So we have residency sometimes. If you do something unlawful, they find out your status. You might do some time in prison and then they might just deport you. In some cases, they might just deport you right away, So these are some of the things that they're talking about. Deferred deportation, even in some places also, people that are leaving the countries because of harm. They might have some type of status, or they get temporary status, where they can stay within the U.S. But nonetheless, it's not really a given status to stay in the U.S. The other piece is talking about court ruling. Judicial decision can be influenced who is subject to deportation, under what circumstances, which can protect certain groups from removal, right? For example, right, just within these few weeks, we're talking about deporting Guatemalan children back to the Guatemala, right? It was a whole plane ready to leave, but the judge said no, right? Like, that's illegal. How you deporting these children, right? Back to the homeland, right? Many ask, like regardless of your idea of how you feel about immigration, migration, and so forth, right? Or this kids that came illegally, but thinking about on a social level, that what does it mean? We're sending all these kids back home, right? Without their parents, right? Without any status, right? And this is some of the things that we're still trying to find out today, even with the countries of right now with ICE, kidnapping of folks, right? We don't know where exactly they're going, So the role deportation, nation building, deportation policy were integral in the way the United States was constructed and national identity of boundaries, right? The author emphasizes how deportation was not just about enforcing law, but about maintaining racial and national purity. These policies targeted non-white immigration, creation of rational category of exclusion, right? So this is the, again, right, racial exclusion and citizenship and legal status, right? When we are talking about who do they want in the U.S. and who do they want in the U.S., right? So if you even, for example, right, the way we're looking at right now with ICE migration, who are the two folks that they're going after, right? Even though within a lot of the media, we see a lot of the brown folks, being deported from LA to Chicago to New York, right? Because these are the heavy bases where a lot of the workers come from. I mean, a lot of the workers exist, right? But also, nonetheless, they're also deporting a lot of Venezuelans, a lot of black folks, Afro Latinx folks, right? So this is a lot of things within the media not showing, but nonetheless, as a people of color who are deported, right? Nowhere have we seen a lot of these ICE agents going into these places, right? That have not, that have been as harm, right, as kidnapping, what I essentially what it is, right? So this is why even today's date, looking at this chapter, we can racialize and see, how is it, why is the author telling us these things that has happened before, but also how things can repeat itself even today's date, right? So again, right, so we're talking about the role deportation, right? So the chapter talks about this whole big role, even how the creation of Border Patrol came to be, right? So this is what happened with the U.S. Migration Station, right, in the 1920s. And then on the bottom piece, I hear what it looks like downtown now, present time. People think that these cases are quick. Within next chapters, or next week's, introduce the concept of how legal migration really exists, right? It's not a simple paper. People think that it's just a year, couple years. From my own experience, my parents took them over 15, 16 years just to get their papers, As one of those unfortunate stories, for example, that I always share with my classes is that, when my grandma passed away in El Salvador, my mom could not go back to the country. Why? Because she did not, her paperwork was in, so once you leave the country and you have paperwork in play, they can take your status away, and it was just fortunate after a year after my mother was able to get residency, and then go visit a grandma, her resting place. But nonetheless, these are some of the things that people don't understand. Like, things happen in life, and you have to take those consequences. That's why if you look at the downtown, you go to downtown, these offices are always packed, and there's not always guaranteed they're going to see you, right? So this is where I'm talking about the role of deportation, how big had it expanded, Even when we look at now, the role of deportation, now you're looking at, the creation of Texas, in 1925, but also talks about who were these people to begin with, right? It wasn't like, people that, wanted to be, how can I say, professional, right? Even when we look at it, where they were talking about the creation of these people were also part of the Klan, right? So even in today's day, we also see how even, I would say, the sheriff department also had it for a minute. That investigation caused other people that had the same tattoos, what it meant, right? So what does that mean? Also, are they a gang or not, right? Even now, when we look at some of these border patrols, right? They're all fascinated and writing, Trump's parade. But even now, what is the newest creation, right? The newest creation now is called ICE. And even a lot of the new agencies coming along, right? So then they have different sectors, but also what does that mean with the budget within the U.S. as well? And also what does it mean? How are we stopping this people? How are we having this stoppage, right? So here you see in 2001, these cops officers were lashing at, black folks, here in the bottom, you see in Texas, they were putting this illegal, I don't know how to, I'm really hard to pronounce it, but these things were harming people, right? Essentially could have killed you too, right? And then obviously the judge said that, no, that was illegal because basically it was in open waters, and you just couldn't do that, Nonetheless, like, why are we creating these things when knowing that migration is happening, but essentially, you're making it even more dangerous than it should be. Yeah. So legal and social marginality, the author most powerful argument is that illegal aliens exist in a state of social and legal marginality. They are part of the fabric of society, contribution to economic culture, but remain excluded from full membership and citizenship. This legal humanity creates permanent unclear with people lives under constant threat, right? So I would say even visiting Iowa, right, like a state that is primarily Caucasian, going over there, my partner's family, I found out that a lot of these people do a lot of construction, right? So what does it mean for these people that, that exist, but also are also blindsided, that these people exist, that people are construction, you know, our cities and so forth. What are we doing when we work in the restaurants, and so much more, right? So this chapter really speaks about, how we're looking at these people from different lenses, and some are bad, and some are great, but nonetheless, the chapter's emphasizing, the way, who do we want and who do we don't want, right? So one of the key points is we're looking at during the Depression, restriction of movement of Mexicans American, false narrative of who is illegal, atmosphere deportation. We're talking about population over 1.4 millions where numerous completely removed, right? Early in the 1930s, only 6 deportations proceed had legal representation, right? So what does it mean with people that have representation, right? In terms of language, and it's just not English. I mean, not just not Spanish, right? Some of these people still speak indigenous, and how are we even helping these people, right? Especially when we don't have translators, that can speak indigenous in some ways. Sometimes these are the questions sometimes that I ask, what is the sense of thought of how migration system is depicting one certain people over other people? And are we still witnessing us the constitutional search and leading to a documented single families deported, right? And some of these things that we see now, even with car washes here, Santa Ana, right? And also, what is gender still focused on migration policy, especially the people we see the most being detained by ICE, police, and so forth are men, right? So these are some of the questions that I always ask. Now looking at the free trade and final conquest of Latin America, right? So I introduced this chapter because I wanted you guys to think about why the migration existed and why does it still continue to exist, right? Not in the concept of this false narrative of people just want to migrate because the idea of what people want to call the American dream, right? But this chapter examines and gives you the narrative why people are migrating to the U.S., right? And one of the main arguments is talk about the agreements, right? The free trade agreement with NAFTA, CAFTA, what does it mean for privatization? What does it mean for Latin America, right? Being colonized, and now what we call modern neoliberalism policies and so forth, right? So historical context of the free trade of Latin America. Colonialism and decolonialism is a stage of economic exploitation. This is extradition economic neoliberalism from the 20th century. The rise of neoliberal policies, the Washington consequences promoted privatization, the relations and open market resolution of open crisis, So these are some of the things that even how policies tend to change, right? And we can see them today's day, such as tariffs. So this is where I'm giving you different terminology, right? In terms of colonialism and neocolonialism, definition on one side is direct political and historical control of a country by foreign powers. And the other one's indirect economic, political, cultural influence exerted by powerful and national nations over weaker ones, right? So one of the studies that, this chapter does talk about is Mexico and NAFTA. 1994, farmers displaced cheap U.S. corn, flooded the market, forcing millions of Mexican farmers out of business. The rise of the maquiladoras, low wages factory jobs grew up and they offer little stability of rights. Increased migration, more people across the U.S., economic hardship. Central America and CAFTA privatization, essentially services of healthcare, water, leading to mass protests. In Argentina, looking at economic collapse, So even looking at Mexico and NAFTA, when we're talking about the maquiladoras, a lot of these factorias or factories are staged in Tijuana, right? So it's easy, so close, and reason why even a lot of the things are easy to get right now, even when we look at such as Amazon, right? That we're looking at things, and we look at Central America now, we look at a lot of places like Guatemala, Honduras, trying to privatize water. We're looking at places like El Salvador, such as the Bitcoin. What does it mean there in El Salvador where it's safe, but also a lot of things are being privatized by different companies as Japanese, but also how are we also getting minerals from El Salvador, right? So what does that mean for when we're talking about environmental justice in El Salvador or in Central America, essentially, right? So these are some of the questions we still ask today, like, has these things changed? Are they getting better? Are they getting worse? Right. So the context of free trade in Latin America, the economic impact of free trade agreement, political and social consequences, and case study examples, some of the things that I was talking about, right? Environmental consequences, exploitation of labor, right? So this is when we talk about the maquiladoras, these low wages, right? Unfortunately, I couldn't have the documentary for this class just because if we were in person, we would watch it. So there's documentaries on Netflix that talks about these factors of women that are being overworked, right? So here in the U.S., we have labor laws, right? Such as overtime, double time, time off, and so forth. And if you don't go by that, then essentially it's illegal. In some of these places, on the other hand, regardless if they're U.S. owned, nonetheless, those rules don't apply to your country, right? So this is why we're talking about exploitation of labor, low wages, poor working conditions, and so forth, right? This is where you're gonna find fathers working two jobs, maybe working 18 hours. You might find mothers, right? That have their kids at home, or even maybe pregnant mothers that are working, to the last minute till they give birth. And these are some of the stories that has come out, from these places of exploitation. So, economic effects, loss of local industries. This is what happened within the U.S. San Fernando Valley, when you saw a lot of the automotive manufacturers, right, being exploited, left. You see, especially Detroit, that was known for making their cars, right, left. Even now when we're trying to bring Hyundai in back into the U.S., but they just got raided by ICE, about 400 people, right? So Hyundai now is trying to pull out maybe the factories that they're trying to make within the U.S., right? So it's all big, again, right, job displacement, right? Like, and obviously the people that they caught in the Hyundai in the East Coast, right? They were using cheap labor, right? But nonetheless, they got deported. So now they're trying to figure out if this factory is going to continue to grow. If not, they're going to close down, right? So this is where I'm talking about many workers lost stable jobs, industry shut down, relocated to other countries for cheap labor, right? So then what the Koreans did, they actually bring in a plane in to pick up these folks that were about to be deported from ICE and just send them back to Korea. So again, what are some of the losses, right? As talked about earlier, increase the depending on foreign investment, right? So this is where we're going to ask for a lot of privatization, right, and so forth, making the market unstable. This is why during certain periods, right, and then again, right, like Kevin brought earlier, right, what does that mean also for tariffs, right? When we're looking especially the farm market, right now, food costs is going a lot higher. A lot of the farmers don't have workers to agriculture the fields, right? Coming from Iowa and going to Iowa, I see a lot of corn that's already drying too much. And they're like, no, the corn's ready, but we don't know who's going to pick it up, right? So these are some of the examples that you're still seeing, and you see a lot of these farmers that have about over 300 of acres of crops asking, like, wait a minute, who's going to buy these? Who's going to buy this soy? Who's going to buy this corn? Especially with the conditions that exist today. But also when we're talking about early on about about migration, right? And these are the things that have happened, right? So if a lot of the jobs that are, in being in like a sense, such as Mexico, Latin America, Central America, even elsewhere, right? The lower wages are going down, right? So what are people going to do? People are going to go for places where they have better wages, even though they have to work longer hours, right? So this is where the mass migration, you see this, right? This is many people have fled, especially Mexico, Central America. This is why we talk about NAFTA when they started doing all these trade agreements. Here I talk about NAFTA before 1990. Look at the migration pattern of 2.5 million documented migrations leaving. After 2000, you see that number skyrocket, right, to 9.4. And again, the last thing I did say is migrants are fleeing these countries are not just looking for jobs, but escaping poverty, violence, instability fueled by economic policies. So these are the things that have happened as well. One of the things that I do end here the slide is speaking about the Zapatistas that happened in 1994, right? So what are the Zapatistas? They're indigenous people, leftists, revolutionary, right? And these people were trying to, they still exist to this day, right? But they're uprising against Mexico, against NAFTA, right? And actually, the same day that NAFTA began, this is the same day where, Zapatistas, took action, right? How to privatize, not private, how to protect their territory, their indigenous people, their language, and so forth, in response, right, to what was happening within the U.S. And Mexico agreement. In Spanish we call it Tratado Libre de Comercio. But these are some of the things that have happened, as uprising as Zapatistas. But now you're seeing it now more on a local level when we are talking about such as NAFTA, such as tariffs and so forth, where people are talking about how people can afford groceries anymore. What does it mean that people can go out anymore? This is why we see a lot of restaurants closing now, a lot of businesses closing. People, even when you start a lot of business, people take a lot of loans out. So this is one of the hardest part when people are having a hard time paying that back, right? Especially if everything's going up. A burger back in the day costing maybe $4.99. Now you're looking at least $10 for a burger. Maybe not even, maybe some fries and a small drink, but other than that, you're not going to go anywhere and pay anything cheap anymore to go out. But these are the top of the consequences that are arising and are coming back into play. So that's for this week's chapter.